All right, so last time we talked about the fundamentals of statistics. We kind of defined some basic terms. So statistics, capital S, the science, and statistics, lowercase s, are the actual computations you make from a sample. We got parameters and statistics. And the basic is you take a sample from a population of interest, make some calculation based on that sample, and you use that calculation to estimate the parameter that you're trying to figure out about the population. Talked about different types of sampling methods. Hey, do you support the death penalty? Out the window. And then we did define bias. Yeah, is this where we stopped? I believe we defined bias, and that's just a study suffers from bias if its design or conduct tends to favor certain results. And I gave you like all studies will implicitly have some kind of bias, right? In statistics, and when you're conducting an observational study or an experiment, you try and reduce that bias as much as possible, but it's pretty much impossible to completely do it. There's a saying in statistics which is you control what you can, block what you can't, and then randomize everything else. And that'll make more sense as we talk about experimental designs right now. So there are two types of studies, basically. You have an observational study in which you just go out and observe or measure characteristics of sample members, but do not attempt to influence or modify those characteristics. And then there's an experiment, which is the opposite. You are applying a treatment. And in this case, an observational study, you can only really conclude association. An experiment is how we determine a causal relationship. Okay. So it's pretty widely known that religion is associated with longevity. Do you know what I mean by that? Religious people tend to live longer. It's a fact. However, that doesn't mean being religious causes you to live longer. Why? Because there's never been a controlled experiment to determine that. Because it would be unethical. Because in a controlled experiment, you take a sample and you decide, this group I'm going to give my treatment and this group I'm not. So that would be like taking a sample of people and forcing them to be religious for their entire life. Taking a sample of people, forcing them to be atheists their entire life. Keeping everything the same other than that. So what other things would I try and keep the same? Their diet, because that could impact it, right? Their living conditions, right? Their happiness. Everything that I can control other than religion, I'm going to try and keep the same. And then see who lives longer. Now that would be an unethical experiment, right? But it is true religion is associated with longevity, meaning we can observe religious people tend to live longer than non-religious people just because they self-select to be religious or to be not religious. But I can't determine a causal relationship because there are too many other variables that could be impacting their longevity. Namely, religious people often have rules that they live by that determine the types of things they put in their body, right? Meaning they tend not to be drug users or drink heavily, right? And maybe that's what's actually impacting their longevity, not the religion part. Does that make sense? So an observational study, you can only really conclude an association. An experiment, we can control, we can have comparison groups, and then we can determine a causal relationship. But to be able to conduct experiments that you would want to have published, like oftentimes the reason we'll do an experiment is to publish it in a scientific journal. Before you conduct the experiment, you have to basically submit your plans to a board of ethics, and it has to be approved, right? So there is a way to, through observational study, to conclude causation. It's just much more difficult. And so the example I'll give is cigarettes. It took them a long time to conclude that cigarettes caused cancer, right? They knew that cigarettes were associated with a higher incidence of cancer, but again, to be able to actually determine causation, you need a controlled experiment. Once they think that something like that causes harm, you're not going to get an experiment past the board of ethics, because if you think something is harming somebody, it's unethical to treat them with that thing, right? So we couldn't just go, all right, let's just get a sample of like 10,000 people and make them smoke 2 packs a day. And then take a sample of people who don't do that, and let's see what the rate of cancer is in both groups. No, once you think it causes harm, it would be unethical to conduct an experiment. However, with a case like cigarettes, they self-select into those 2 groups, right? So you do have people who are just smoking 2 packs a day. You have thousands of people who are doing that, and you have people who weren't. And there was enough evidence, along with evidence from other experiments, like they did do experimentation on animals, no matter how you feel about it. That's the case, that happens, and that does push science forward. And they found, oh, hey, if we make these mice live in smoke-filled cages, they develop cancer. So that, along with observational data, allowed causation to be determined. All right, let's talk about an experiment. In an experiment, you have a treatment group who receives the treatment being tested, and a control group who does not receive the treatment being tested. And it's very important for the treatment and control groups to be selected randomly and to be alike in all respects except for the treatment. Meaning, you're going to try and control everything about the subjects that you can aside from the treatment. Keep it the same. You always want to randomize your groups, meaning once you have your sample, you don't let them self-select into the treatment or the control group. That can cause all sorts of bias, right? So like, if I'm trying to figure out whether music helps students study or distract them from it, and I'm going to have a treatment group where I have students listen to music while they study and a control group where they don't, I wouldn't want to let students select into that, because then Trey would probably go, I'll take the music group. But now I've introduced bias because maybe Trey just likes to listen to music. So for him, it does work better. I would want to randomly assign people the treatment or the control group. And then with drugs, you run into what's called the placebo effect, right? Which is where your body can have a physical response to psychosomatic stimulus. So meaning like, we just sort of participate, or you probably didn't participate in it, but globally, we just had probably the largest statistical study ever done in history with the vaccine trials, right? People who volunteered into that, they couldn't tell them whether they were giving them the true vaccine or just saline, because your body can respond to, like I said, psychosomatically to stimulus. You can think that you're getting better, and you will get better in many cases. And so what we want to test, okay, how much better does the vaccine work than people just thinking they got the vaccine? Turns out it worked significantly better, which is good news for us because now we're all getting vaccines. All right. So here you go. Placebo, it lacks the active ingredient of a treatment being tested in a study, but is identical in appearance to the treatment. So you don't want your subjects to be able to distinguish the placebo from the real treatment. And the placebo effect just refers to the situation which patients improve simply because they believe they are receiving a useful treatment. And I want to be clear that the placebo effect is real. It's not like patients pretending to be better. It's just that your body does respond that strongly to mental stimulus. All right, let's talk about the term blinding. So this just means keeping people in the dark about who is in the treatment group and who is in the control group. And so we're going to talk about two different types of blinding. We're going to talk about single blind and double blind. So this kind of goes along with placebo. If you're testing a drug and you need your control group to receive a placebo, you don't want them to know that they're receiving the placebo, so you don't tell them that they're not receiving the active drug, right? So you've blinded your subjects to their treatment. So a single blind study or a single blind experiment, the subjects just don't know that they're not receiving, or what treatment they're receiving, I should say. And then there's something called a double blind experiment. And in that case, that would be like if your experiment does involve drugs and it involves diagnosing patients, then me as the statistical researcher, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a medical doctor. So what I would need to do is hire a medical doctor to come in and diagnose my patients, right? But oftentimes, especially in things like pain medication, the diagnosis may be influenced by what treatment the patient is receiving. So the doctor could be like, oh, they're on morphine, so their pain level shouldn't be that high. And that could influence the way they diagnose it, right? So in that case, you don't want the patients to know what treatment they're receiving, and you also don't want the doctor diagnosing to know what treatment they're receiving because you don't want it to influence the way the doctor diagnoses them. So that's double blind. The statistician would know. They're never blinded to it. You just don't want the person interacting with the patients to know what treatment is being delivered. All right. So a case control study, this is kind of what I was talking about. This is a specific type of observational study that is almost an experiment. And it's because the sample naturally divides itself into two or more groups. So it's almost like you're doing an experiment, except you're not administering the treatment. The subjects are administering the treatment to themselves. So smoking, the observational study on smoking would be case control because some people smoke and other people don't smoke. So the people that smoke are just administering their own treatment. Now, it's not as good as an experiment because you can't control everything else about the study, right? Like you can't tell the smokers, hey, I need to keep you on the same diet as the non-smokers. But it's better than a normal observational study. All right. So for this experiment, let's identify any problems and explain how the problems could have been avoided. A chiropractor performs adjustments on 25 patients with back pain. Afterward, 18 of the patients say they feel better. He concludes that the adjustments are an effective treatment. So this reminds me of like there was a Simpsons episode. Anyway, the premise was like, well, there are no tigers around me right now. Do you all agree? So this remote control actively keeps tigers away from me. That's kind of the same logic as this chiropractor is using. Right? So here's what I would say about his experiment. There is no control group. For comparison. So if we wanted to improve this, you could create a placebo. I don't know how you would do that. Maybe just put your hands on them, but don't do an adjustment. But a lot of people like stuff like this, right? There's like the sunken cost, sort of a sunken cost bias where it's like, well, I'm paying you a bunch of money to have this done. I went and had it done, so yeah, I'm going to say I feel better. You kind of want to feel better because you're doing this thing. Do you know what I mean? So there's a little bit of bias introduced that way. He would need to create a control group where he brought them in, had them spend the money, but didn't actually do adjustments on them. And then when they left, ask how many of them feel better. So that's the issue with that one. There's no control group. All right, what about this one? A new drug for a type of attention deficit disorder is supposed to make affected children less disruptive. Randomly selected children suffering from the disorder are divided into treatment and control groups. Those in the control group receive a placebo that looks just like the real drug. The experiment is single blind, and experimenters interview the children one-on-one to decide whether they become more polite. Pretty good, right? There's a control group. There's a placebo group. So we're comparing. They're attempting to keep everything the same. Here's what I would say. I don't think that the problem is well defined. What is disruptive? And what is more polite? And also, they said it's single blind. I would feel like the experimenter, if they knew they received the actual ADD drug, would be more inclined to diagnose a child as more polite, right? So I'm going to say this should be double blind. And also needs objective definitions of disruptive versus polite. Because, I mean, people can have different ideas about what the different tolerances for what disruptive versus polite would be. All right, any questions on that example? Colin says, also, a person may not answer truthfully when asking a question like that. So shouldn't it be observed? Wait, what question are you talking about, Colin? Are you talking about the last one? Oh, this one?
No, I was talking about how uh if they wanted to actually get results, shouldn't they observe whether or not the children were or like their behavior was affected rather than asking them?
Right. I think, okay, I see. I think they're going to ask him a series of questions to try and like agitate them or sort of see how they're not going to go, are you feeling more polite? Yeah, that wouldn't be a good tactic. But I think the idea was that they are observing the way they respond to certain questions.
Okay.
I agree with you. Okay, so for these, I want to know, we're trying to answer this question. Are we going to use an observational study, a case control study, which is a type of observational study that kind of looks like an experiment, or are we going to do an experiment? So the first one is, I just want to know the average income of stockbrokers. Can I answer that question with an observational study, a case control, or an experiment? If I want to know the average income of stockbrokers, don't overthink this. Do I need to kidnap multiple infants, raise them to be financial? Yeah, no, we can, that data just exists out there, right? We can just go find what the average income is. We don't need to do some unethical experiment where we raise a bunch of stockbrokers. Observational study. Do seatbelts save lives? Observational, case control, or experiment? Just an observational? Case control. So it would be unethical to do an experiment, right? To like get a group of people and go, hey, go get in an accident, but keep your seatbelt on. You guys, seatbelts off. But some people wear seatbelts and some don't, and that data, the mortality data, is out there, right? So they've already separated themselves into those two groups. We know that seatbelts do save lives because the incidence of death in accidents where people are wearing seatbelts is much lower than those where people aren't, right? But that's, I agree, case control. Can lifting weights improves runners' time in a 10K race? Yeah, I agree. Naomi says experiment. This would probably be fine to do an experiment with. There's nothing unethical about having a group of runners that don't lift. Maybe they just train by running, and a group that trains by running and also lifts, and comparing their times. So experiment would be good there. Can an herbal remedy reduce the severity of colds? What do you think? Observational, case control, or experiment? Dylan? I agree. Now, let's be a little bit more precise. What kind of experiment do we need? If we want to test this, do we just want to test it against nothing? Right. But you would want to test it against a control group who you'd want also taking something, but that's not the treatment. So you would want a placebo group, right? Which means we need at least a single blind study here. Now, I would also argue that when we're talking about severity of colds, we would need a doctor to diagnose how severe the cold is. So you probably want it to be double blind. So I'm going to say double blind experiment. So double blind experiment. All right. So we're getting towards the end here. The margin of error is used to describe a confidence interval that is likely to contain the true parameter or the true population parameter. So the easiest way to think about this is anytime you saw a poll, like a political poll in the last year, that's what we call the confidence interval. Why is this not updating? I'm sorry. There we go. And so a confidence interval is just an interval of numbers that's meant to capture the parameter that we're looking for. So oftentimes, in a political poll, you'll see like candidate A is polling at 51%, and they'll give you the margin of error as 3%. Well, that means they could be polling as high as 54% or as low as 48%. Does that make sense? And that margin of error is just supposed to account for the fact that if we went and took a different sample, we would likely get a slightly different poll number, just due to variability from sample to sample. That's not, here's what the margin of error doesn't account for: bad sampling. So it's not meant to cover up like if you went to the gun store and that's where you took your poll. No, that's a bad sample and probably not representative of the overall population. So you just need to make sure you go to the gun store and, I don't know, what's the opposite of that? The tea shop. All right, so you create it by taking your sample statistic, you subtract your margin of error, and then you add your margin of error, and that gives you an interval of numbers. So an election eve poll finds 52% of surveyed voters plan to vote for Smith, and she needs a majority to win without a runoff. The margin of error is 3 percentage points. Will she win? Well, if I add to that, that's 55%. If I subtract 3 from 52, I have 49%. Any value in that interval is equally likely to be the true value of the voters who are going to vote for her. Is she guaranteed to win? No. So I'm going to say actually equally likely to have the majority or not. You're not going to, yeah, the way they determine the margin of error, if you take AP stats, you'll come up with the actual formula for that, but it depends on a couple of things. It depends on the sample size, so basically how many people you survey, and it depends on the confidence level, so how confident you want to be that the interval actually captures your parameter of interest. And it's just a formula. But usually they try and keep the margin of error around 3%. For this class, you're not going to have to determine the margin of error. It'll just be given to you. I think that's it, folks. We got a problem set. You got a good chunk of time, so get it done in class, and I'll